Oh great, Miles is getting his own Clone Saga and people still think that the previous Clone Saga was bad. Because it's not. I assume everyone who knows Spider-Man knows about the Clone Saga, one of the more infamous Spider-Man stories which came out during the 90s where a lot of things were viewed as stupid and wacky to a lot of people. It lasted from 1994 to 1996, which was a lot given the fact that I went through 4 different Spider-Man series that were going on at the same time. Meaning we would get like a new issue weekly to monthly, making it over just 70 issues from 1994 to 95. I recently just reread it and most of the stuff that I missed out on, which was a lot. Personally, to me, the whole story was nice. Well, on a binge reading standpoint, I don't know how it was like for people in the 90s. I had Marvel Unlimited with me since I didn't have that much to do during my Christmas break and decided to just read all of it. Personally, I just felt like talking about it for a new video. The story takes place mostly after the first initial Clone Saga that was from the 70s, the one where we assume the clone that Peter fought died. Turns out he was alive and just went into hiding for 5 years, but comes back to New York once he hears that Aunt May was in a coma, but meets with Peter, then fights it out, and then they basically become bros down the road. I would like to mention this was during the very short time when Peter was pulling a Daredevil and saying that Peter Parker is dead, I am the Spider. After that story with Judas Traveler, which by the way I never really cared about Judas at all because he kinda sucks. I mean, to me all he did was just show up and leave. It felt like to me he just appeared 100 times throughout the parts of the Clone Saga, but it was only like 3 times he appeared. But anyway, Ben becomes the new Scarlet Spider, and as his first major villain he fights by himself was Venom, which was one of my favorite stories from it. We also have Kane into this whole story, which I liked him a lot as a character. He had this thing of hating Ben Reilly but wanting to basically protect Peter and have his life just be fine. He also was the first failed clone of Peter. There was also the fact that around this time MJ was pregnant, meaning that Peter and MJ would finally become parents. Later on we get the Smoke and Mirrors story, which was generally fine to me. I don't really get on why people hated it. Jackal returns looking like a green version of the Joker, and by the last couple parts of it, it was just him messing with Ben and Peter on who's the real one and who's the fake, with another clone of Gwen Stacy which just dies immediately. I will say I did honestly like most of the stories here, and it was generally a nice and enjoyable read, even though it took me 10 days to read everything because I got distracted a lot. Issue 400 of The Amazing Spider-Man was really good. It was a fitting end to Aunt May with her knowing this whole time that Peter was Spider-Man. Dave Mateus handled it perfectly. Then a couple years later they just retconned her death. This was after the whole Clone Saga ended, and by the way I still don't like that they just retconned her death because it was a fitting end to her character. Anyway, this whole part of the Clone Saga ends with the trial of Peter Parker and maximum clonage. The trial of Peter Parker was honestly fine. I had no problems with it, mostly connected to the issues that were set after 400 where Peter Parker was arrested for what Kane did during the Lost Years story, which Lost Years takes place immediately after the 70s Clone Saga and shows the life of what happened to Ben after he figured out he was the clone. Anyways, by the end of the trial of Peter Parker, we get the big twist that this whole time Ben was the real Peter Parker and that the Peter that we knew after the very first Clone Saga was the clone the whole time. It's understandable why people at the time were mad because you're changing something that people grew up with only for a twist. Upon reading it during this time, I just see it as a cool twist to add to a story, so then maximum clonage happens. In maximum clonage, Peter decides to team up with the Jackal just because he learns that he's the clone and is acting like it's all over for him. It ends with the Jackal dying at the bridge where Gwen died. Peter also comes to the fact that he's the clone but still has a family to take care of. Honestly, maximum clonage was just really fine until the end, though we did get Spider-Side, my favorite stupid character that came out from all of this, only just to die shortly. A couple of stories later, we get the Greatest Responsibility story where we get a new Doc Ock, which is the daughter of Seward Trainer, a friend of Ben during his time of being gone for 5 years before he came back. It all ended with Peter wanting to give Ben the Spider-Man costume, meaning that Peter is done being Spider-Man and wants to just be a dad for his future daughter. But Ben declines as he is on his own path now, and with that it just ends that part of the Clone Saga, making it a total of 76 issues. There are also Ben Reilly Spider-Man stories, which is basically a whole different part of the Clone Saga. So Ben Reilly becomes Spider-Man and makes his own suit, which is my favorite suit that is not the classic suit. Honestly, I enjoyed Ben's time as Spider-Man a lot. It was fun seeing him into this new life as the only Spider-Man since Peter in the short Spider-Man Final Adventure story lost his powers, so he's just a normal guy. If you don't feel like reading the first part of the Clone Saga at all, I just at least advise you to read this part of Ben being Spider-Man. It's mostly his time as Spider-Man, with there only being a major clone thing like once until the end with Revelations. I did like Peter and MJ returning to New York, and Peter just works at the Bugle as a regular guy while helping Ben, and to everyone else outside, they're just cousins that are seeing each other after 5 years. It really made Ben one of my favorite characters to read, and I suggest that you read it too. Revelations did honestly feel like a better conclusion to all of this. Most people think that the twist with Norman was bad. I still think that it was a nice twist to bring him back, and for the whole time he was doing everything behind the scenes and even manipulated Jackal to make the clones the whole time. The whole last issue of it was honestly one of my favorite issues to read. At the end of Revelations, we come to figure out that MJ got a miscarriage, which sucks after all the time of waiting for Peter and MJ to finally become parents. If only we had a story to that where they were parents and were able to retrieve their daughter, which so happens to have the same powers as Peter, and somehow end up as a surprisingly good story. Aw, for real? So that's mostly the Clone Saga. It's nowhere near as bad as people make it to be, and maybe if you read it for yourself, you probably might not hate it too. I can't relate to the people who lived in the 90s and were waiting for it to end and was just reading it as it went on, but for a binge read, it's honestly nice to just read and enjoy most of the things there. I can't really say how Miles' Clone Saga is gonna be, because it is literally trying to bank off of the name and just so it can get more readers, since comic Miles is still boring after Bendis, but whatever. So in conclusion, the Clone Saga is good. You're just mean.